I recently read Yoram Hazony's 2018 book, The Virtue of Nationalism, and it was rather difficult to get through for me. Not because the book was complex or poorly written or dense at all. The book is actually rather straightforward and written clearly. It was just one of those books, though, where every other sentence was so full of chutzpah and deceptive half-truths that I had to get up and stop reading out of pure frustration of the trickery that was going on. That aside, though, the thesis of Hazony's book is that we need a world of Westphalian-style nation-states, and he specifically is drawn on the Old Testament example of Israel, where there is one indisputable group in power, while also allowing for the freedom of various minorities, and the state is a tribal state and doesn't strive for higher ideals that lead to what he calls imperialism. This, he says, is the best world order, for it prevents violence within states, since there are no internal power struggles between various ethnic groups that we see, for instance, in various post-colonial states in Africa and the Middle East, with their artificial borders of straight lines that ignore tribal lines and tribal denominations. As well, it prevents conflict on the international scale, since the scope of each state is relatively small and disputes remain local and no state strives for world domination. Now, while this book has some things I would agree with, such as Hazony's attacks on what he calls the liberal construction of the state, which is defined as a state created by individuals in a state of nature coming together through rational calculus to form a state. But the book is just so full of covert poison pills that it seemed plausible on the surface that I thought I needed to dedicate a whole video discussing the subversive ideas interwoven into his alleged program of quote-unquote nationalism. Aside from his covert poison pills, though, there are some more open distortions of the truth that he engages in that I want to talk about first. An example of this is the way that Hazony talks about the Middle East, specifically Syria and Israel. In a discussion about Syria and how it is an artificial post-colonial state and not a proper tribal nation state as envisioned in his book, he says that Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, and the religious group he belongs to, the Shia Alawites, are not in fact Muslim. Quote, "The result of creating the Syrian state has been that this mass of violently opposed groups lived through 2 decades of chronic instability and state oppression, until the Alawites, a non-Muslim nationality or tribe with a religion and historic identity of its own, were finally able to seize power." So Hazony here is making the claim that Alawites are not Muslim, which is a very controversial claim to say the least. Most Alawites would consider themselves Muslims, and most other Muslims, both of the Sunni and the Shia tradition, recognize Alawites as Muslims, and the state constitution of Syria even says that a Muslim has to be the president, and Bashar al-Assad as an Alawite is president, so he must be a Muslim. No one in Syria really contests this claim at all. And even a cursory internet search shows that this is beyond false, and how this line exactly got past his editors in seemingly every review of the book that has come out is beyond me. The first line of the Wikipedia page for Alawites says that the Alawi or the Alawites or Nusayris are a sect of Shia Islam. Literally, the first line of Wikipedia confirms that they are Islamic. I mean, you can make a claim that they're not Islamic because they're more of a syncretic religion and they have some beliefs that aren't in line with the more mainstream versions of Islam, but to say it just outright they're non-Muslim is a very weird line that he says. But let's move on, because this isn't even the most egregious intellectual offense that Hazony commits. So just a few lines later, after he says that claim about Bashar al-Assad and his religion, he goes on to describe the Syrian civil war, which has Assad's secular government fighting against ISIS, affiliates of al-Qaeda, and other radical Islamist groups. But he describes this civil war as merely the Alawite attempt to prevent, quote, "the establishment of a Sunni Arab regime at a cost of 500,000 deaths and the displacement of perhaps half the population of the country." Several problems here. First, let's note how he describes ISIS, al-Qaeda, and the other groups. He doesn't call them ISIS, al-Qaeda, or al-Nusra. Instead, they're simply referred to as Sunni Arab nationalists. This is a whitewashing and, frankly, a romanticization of the radical Sunni Islamic fight against Assad's government. The romanticism of ISIS and al-Qaeda doubles, though, when you realize that these groups are not grassroots groups, but rather they have benefited immensely from the U.S. policy of covert aid to these radical organizations as well. It is also strange that Hazony supports ISIS in their attempt to make Syria a part of their pan-Islamic caliphate, but is against the European Union and their pan-Europeanism, and he calls it, in fact, an imperialist project, even though the EU only allows European countries to join it according to their own rules and constitution. Much the same way ISIS restricts itself from truly global ambitions by merely wanting sovereignty over the Islamic world and parts of the former Umayyad Caliphate, such as the Iberian Peninsula. So, referring back to my last video on Dugin's geopolitics, as to why Hazony is okay with an Islamic or Sunni Islamic civilization or large space, but is not okay with the European large space or civilization, is one of the many contradictions that persist throughout his whole work. And this is just one of many that I'm going to elaborate upon in this video. So I want to requote Hazony again here. He says, "The Alawites have continued to prevent the establishment of a Sunni Arab regime at a cost of 500,000 deaths and the displacement of perhaps half the population of the country. Compare these states to their close neighbor, Israel, which was founded at almost the same time. Israel was established in 1948 as a national state for the Jewish people after the withdrawal of the British from the country." Hazony then goes on to give the romantic account of the founding of Israel, and then he asks, what gives Israel the ability to flourish as a free state, even offering extensive protections to national and tribal minority groups, while states such as Syria and Iraq have at no point attained stability except through the most bloodthirsty state terror? His answer is that Israel is constituted as a national state, and not an artificial, multi-ethnic, post-colonial state. But let's briefly take an actual historical look at his claim. His claim is that Israel doesn't have to use state terror to maintain stability, but that's precisely what it did to be founded. Paramilitary groups like the Irgun, which the first generation of Israeli prime ministers were all former members of, engaged in massive ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, as well as terrorist attacks to establish their state, such as the King David Hotel bombing. Over 700,000 Palestinians were forced from their homelands due to this Jewish terrorism and ethnic cleansing. But this is just the tip of the iceberg, and others have gone much more into depth than I want to go into here. I simply wish to point out the irony in stating that Syria and Iraq used state terror to maintain stability, which is exactly what Israel does. But I guess in a way he is right, since Israel doesn't have to use state terror in the way it used to have to do in its founding, because it already ethnically cleansed the population in the 40s, just like how Jews in the Old Testament ethnically cleansed Israel of the Canaanites. Hazony has other ridiculous claims as well, most stemming from his foaming-at-the-mouth Zionism, which has him, for instance, making the claim that Israel is held to a higher standard than Iran and other Arab states because of the Kantian view of history, which is a liberal view that holds Israel to a higher standard because as a European people or perceived European people, they are supposed to be more developed and thus held to a higher standard than those other countries. Whole tomes could be written debunking this absurdity, but I'll limit it here to pointing out the fact that Israel has several nuclear weapons, and is the only nuclear power to not have signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Agreement. When it comes to this, no one in the Western media or government says a word, but when Iran so much as has domestic nuclear enrichment for energy production, the same media silence over Israel loses their mind over Iran. Next, and this is going to start blending into my more overarching critique of Hazony. So next we have Hazony making the outright laughable claim, such as calling former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher as someone who was against the liberal order, despite Thatcher herself being influenced by prominent liberals that Hazony sharply criticizes himself in his own book, such as Friedrich von Hayek. To add even more irony to this, in the same page that the Iron Lady is praised as some anti-liberal, Hazony criticizes Hayek. This, however, is not a fluke or an oversight, but a systemic problem of contradictions that plague his entire book. I would also like to point out that Hazony also makes the strange claim that Ronald Reagan was also a nationalist against liberalism, but this is only in passing, to be fair. In writing of Thatcher's resistance to the European Union, he says, according to Thatcher's view, a genuinely empiricist approach to economics will favor variation in the economies of different nations. This will be true in economics as it is in every other sphere. The competition among independent national economies will offer the greatest field for experimentation, leading, by means of trial and error, to advances in legal and regulatory structure, in taxation, and the kinds of trade agreements that are concluded between nations. Advances that would not be made in the context of a single economic system imposed on all. Such innovation will be made by independent national states competing with one another, and will be imitated and spread across the globe where they are shown unequivocally to have benefited the nations that first adopted them. Hazony also reiterates his own adoption of this view, writing that the political order is in this respect much like the economic order. The reality is that no human being and no group of human beings possess the necessary powers of reason and the necessary knowledge to dictate the political constitution that is appropriate for all mankind. Anyone tending to a skeptical and empirical point of view will thus recognize the advantages of a nationalist order, which permits many independent national states and allows them to freely compete. What we have here is nothing revolutionary from Hazony or Thatcher. All we have, in fact, is the logic of rational and economic calculation being applied to the geopolitical realm. By this logic, nations are stripped of a sense of tradition and culture, and are instead reduced to just following whatever is the most utilitarian economic program, which is discovered through competition between nation-states in a seemingly scientific and mechanistic fashion. It is no surprise, as I will touch on later, that Hazony heavily cites the liberal utilitarian philosopher John Stuart Mill throughout his work. However, before that, we need to examine a contradiction that Hazony has just made. Let's look at this quote Hazony wrote earlier in his book. Quote, "When a philosopher seeks to found the state on the individual's freedom, calculations of personal benefit and consent, he asks us to see the state as a large business enterprise. He takes an ideal type that has been developed to describe behavior in the marketplace and transfers it into the political sphere, supposing it will permit us to understand political behavior in the same way that it permitted us to understand economic behavior. But a free state is not a business enterprise. It is constituted and continues to exist in time, not because of business-like calculations of personal benefit and ongoing consent among its members, but only due to the family-like bonds of mutual loyalty that persist among them." But then later in his book, he is talking about the state being an economic unit and praising fellow so-called nationalist Margaret Thatcher's conception of the state as a huge business enterprise that competes with other states, perceived as such as well. This is precisely applying marketplace behavior to the realm of politics, which Hazony explicitly warns against earlier in his book, saying, "A free state is not a business enterprise." So here a major contradiction comes to light. Hazony creates a very explicit dichotomy of mutually exclusive views of the state, the rational business state or the states of mutual bonds of loyalty, yet advocates for both at separate places in his book. Specifically, the later you get into his book, the more liberal the work becomes and starts to outright contradict some of the more anti-liberal parts of the beginning of the book, which essentially negates the very little that is good about the book. After the aforementioned quote of praising Thatcher, he says 2 paragraphs later that there is little historical evidence to support the supposition that the imperial, i.e. the non-nation state, is better suited to protect individual freedom. On the contrary, the imperial state known to us have all been autocratic regimes of one kind or another. Meanwhile, the development of the tradition of individual rights and liberties arose only in national states, and some political theorists have suggested that the national state is the only environment in which free institutions can be made stable. John Stuart Mill, writing in Considerations on Representative Government, 1861, speaks for the prevailing 19th century view in arguing that it is a necessary condition of free institutions that the boundaries of government should coincide in main with those of nationalities. Nothing that has taken place in the subsequent century and a half has given us reason to believe that his assessment is mistaken. Why should this be? The tradition of individual rights and freedoms is rooted in the Constitution of Moses and has been developed most diligently and successfully in the laws of England and America. In these countries, the rights and freedoms of the individual have never existed by themselves, but have been part of a more extensive structure of what may be called free institutions. Now, if I had not known better when I read these quotes and not know who I was reading, I would assume that this was a self-identified liberal waxing lyrically about the greatness of his ideology. But no, this is the so-called nationalist conservative who has proclaimed himself to be against liberalism. So after equating the nation state to being just this economical unit, even though his anthropological formulation at the start of the book correctly states that states are founded as tribal collectives and not economic units, Hazony decides that it's time to own the libs at their own game by saying that, in fact, his system of nation-states protects the basic liberal precepts of individual rights better than liberal states do themselves. To requote the author, the tradition of individual rights and freedoms is rooted in the Constitution of Moses, the national state construction, and has been developed most diligently and successfully in the laws of England and America. If Hazony had a problem with liberalism, then he would see this as an issue and not as something to write home about. For if the problem with liberalism is the individualism, as he states in the beginning parts of his book, then that your system protects individualism better than liberalism is not an own against the liberals, it's an own against yourself, and it shows how weak your ideology and your political thought is. Then there is the issue of John Stuart Mill, who has 6-page appearances according to the index, but also has several footnotes dedicated to expanding upon his ideas as well. Exactly why Mill is such a positive influence on Hazony, and especially for his conception of nationalism, is very strange if you assume that Hazony is an illiberal nationalist, but makes perfect sense when considered from the point of view that Hazony is more liberal than he is illiberal. For Mill is a liberal through and through. He bickered with the conservatives in British Parliament, he was one of the first feminist thinkers, and thought that the individual was supreme above collectives. The major difference between Mill and other liberal thinkers who pretty much agree with him on his conclusions is how exactly Mill reaches his conclusions. Rather than having a rights-based approach such as John Locke or a justice-focused approach such as John Rawls, Mill has a utilitarian approach. And it is fitting that throughout the book, Hazony cites Mill as a supporter of nationalism. For when you peel back and look at what Mill's nationalism is really about, it is not about the right of self-determination of peoples or some sort of existentialist nationalism, but rather it is a conclusion he reaches from a utilitarian and economic viewpoint about what is best for the ontological existence of the individual. This is fairly evident both in Mill's writing and his most famous work titled On Liberty, which Hazony himself cites quite a bit, and also in the exposition that Hazony himself gives on Mill's ideas. Take for instance this quote of Hazony. Observing Austria-Hungary of his day, Mill saw that the respective nationalities have no way of attaining a mutual loyalty to one another in an imperial state. Sharing neither language nor religion, they cannot recognize themselves as a genuine unity, but rather as competitors, each threatened by the others. This isn't an endorsement of nationalism as a deeply rooted ontological or even metaphysical institution, but rather an endorsement of nationalism on purely utilitarian grounds. Even looking at direct quotes from Mill's own writings in his work On Liberty illuminates this. And here I have picked a few that I'm going to read out for you guys. He who lets the world, or his own portion of it, choose his plan of life for him, has no need of any other faculty than the ape-like one of imitation. He who chooses his plan for himself employs all his faculties. The despotism of custom is everywhere the standing hindrance to human advancement, being an unceasing antagonism to that disposition to aim at something better than customary, which is called, according to circumstances, the spirit of liberty or that of progress or improvement. A people, it appears, may be progressive for a certain length of time, and then stop. When does it stop? When it ceases to possess individuality. We have a warning example in China. The modern regime of public opinion is, in an unorganized form, what the Chinese educational and political systems are in an organized, and unless individuality shall be able to successfully to assert itself against this yoke, Europe, notwithstanding its noble antecedents and its professed Christianity, will tend to become another China. Mill very much believed in the supremacy and ontological primacy of the individual, and simply saw nation-states as better than the multi-ethnic amalgamations of the various empires of his day, for at least under some sort of petty nationalism, the individual wouldn't die in some ethnic conflict within the country. And it is also fitting that Hazony throughout the book cites America and Britain as models for what nation-states should be, when for the past few hundred years, these two states have been some of the most flamboyant violators of the rights of peoples and nations in the international realm through imperialism and colonialism. This is another view where he actually aligns himself with John Stuart Mill, for Mill was an actual advocate of imperialism. He worked for over 3 decades in the British East India Company, and while he gave some avant-garde criticisms of British colonialism in its specific instantiations, he didn't have a problem with the project overall of colonialism. In fact, the idea of an advanced country taking over underdeveloped peoples and advancing them and westernizing them meshes well with the Millite project of wanting to maximize the individual. And if you're perhaps thinking that I'm overplaying the extent to which Hazony is a Millite, and that perhaps Hazony is just using him for convenient quotes, then consider this very explicit statement that Hazony makes. He says, "I have proposed that the best political order is one of independent national states. My view resembles that of Mill, who saw the independence of national states as an evident good and urged that such states should be established where it is feasible." He also has a footnote about Mill saying, "My definition of nationalism draws on a tradition of political thought exemplified by Mill, who argued that it is, in general, a necessary condition of free institutions that the boundaries of government should coincide in the main with those of nationalities." But let us remember that Mill was very much an individualist, and very much so a liberal. So if his idea of nationalism is exemplified by Mill, we can only conclude, especially with all the other evidence I have given so far, that Hazony is just a liberal of slightly different stripes, just like Mill was. For all his attacks on liberalism, which are one of the more redeeming qualities of this book, Hazony is just attacking a particular strand of liberalism while defending his own variation of liberalism, much like how Mill differed from many liberals of his day, but still reached the same conclusions as them. So what Hazony has done throughout his whole work is narrowly define liberalism to be associated with the more candid liberals of Hayek, Mises, and Locke, who openly say they want to destroy nations because they're forms of collectives which stifle the individual. But Hazony then counterattacks, not by attacking their underlying assumptions of things like individualism, but rather by arguing that individual freedom and economic logic is better realized through his system rather than the systems of Hayek, Mises, or Locke. One of the main differentiations between these liberals and Hazony is Hazony's belief in the nation-state and the structures of free institutions that exist inside of it, which he claims in part give the individual his freedom. These free institutions are 1. The laws of the nation are prior to the will of the king or president and independent of it. 2. The powers of the king or president are limited by the representatives of the nation, whose advice and consent he must obtain to tax the nation, alter its laws, or appoint officers over them. 3. The rights of the individual are to be infringed upon by the state only by due process of the laws. 4. The laws are ordered so as to protect, among other things, the right of the individual to life, marriage, and property, as well as freedom of speech, movement, association, and religion. And 5. Public elections are held to designate officials in some branches of government. For the sake of brevity and at risk of sounding redundant, I'm not going to cover every single plank of his conception of free institutions, but I will focus on the first point, and what I think is the most important, namely that the law is prior and independent to the will of the king. This idea is another place where we can suss out a contradiction in Hazony's political theory. For the idea that the sovereign or the king does not will the laws into creation is fundamentally incompatible with his original view of the genesis of the state, wherein the nation-state comes into being by 2 ethnic groups coming together and forming the state either through mutual agreement for protection or through one group domineering over the other. For this view of the birth of the state necessitates that the laws of a nation-state don't actually exist until they are created once one ethnic group joins with another ethnic group through either mutual agreement or through domination of one over the other. Thus the laws, and the nation-state more generally, only come into existence after sovereignty or control of the 2 groups merge, via a king or some other sort of sovereign, which then establishes and wills new laws over the state. There is no other way going by the way he describes the creation of a state in his book, where ultimately some person or persons don't end up establishing the laws over the subjects or the citizens. Then there is the argument that Carl Schmitt raised against the primacy of laws over the sovereign, which he calls a mathematical mythology, for the proponents of this theory of the state can never explain the genesis of these laws if not from some sort of sovereign power. And this task becomes infinitely harder when, like Hazony, you reject a natural rights theory, rationalism, and a priori axioms generally speaking. This idea of a nation of laws also contradicts his formulation of the nation-state in that you can't have states based on the idea, proposed by Hazony, that it's best if one particular group has overwhelming domination of a geographical area while also believing that laws are prior to the sovereign. For group domination is not at all based on the rule of law, but a will to power which implies a sovereign. Yet the theory that laws precede and predate the sovereign denies that the former ever happened, since the sovereign didn't come about until laws were made. But Hazony's anthropological theory implies the existence of a sovereign before laws, as previously stated. At best, Hazony could respond to this reasoning by saying that this only proves that the laws aren't prior to the sovereign, but that a king could still create a legal system whereby that legal system becomes independent and even makes the king inferior to it, which is one of the planks of his free institutions. But here we just have a liberal fantasy story on par with other liberal fantasies such as the Veil of Ignorance or the State of Nature, where men aren't above the law. If this truly was the case, then that state simply wouldn't have a sovereign, and the state wouldn't be built on bonds of personal and cultural loyalty as he claims, but rather it would be a rationalistic state that is devoid of any human aspect to it and is only following the dictates of laws. And now perhaps Hazony or one of his supporters could argue that the laws are established by the people who enshrine their nationalism in the law, perhaps on par with the Israeli nation-state law, which established in the legal code that Israel is a Jewish state. But if it requires a law to tell you that you are a tribal nation-state, then you are not a tribal nation-state, but rather a legalistic state that is a tribal national state only because the laws say so and not because of any philosophical weight given to the idea of nationalism or culture. And there is no non-utilitarian argument that can be given against everyone being, say, an atomized individual, a communistic new man, or a Buddhist ascetic if that's what the laws dictated. Hazony's formulation of the laws being independent to the sovereign gives equipollence value to every type of structure of society and is not an argument in his favor. And this further proves my point of Hazony being a sort of utilitarian liberal in the same vein as John Stuart Mill, for he has, perhaps inadvertently, constructed a system of metaphysical equipollence value to many different types of systems and can only show that his side is the best side through utilitarian arguments. Lastly, there is going to be what I am going to call the common sense argument. Everyone instinctively knows that the judicial supremacy over the sovereign is pure ideological fantasy, which is why appointments to the Supreme Court of the US are political. If we truly had a nation of laws, not men, and laws were independent of the ruler, which Hazony claims, and also says is exemplified in the US, then it wouldn't be a partisan issue whether or not a Federalist Society judge is picked or not. All Hazony is doing with his idea of free institutions and his concept of it is engaging in liberal mythologies that are fundamentally at odds with the empirical reality of the world which he feigns to be so concerned with. And now we see what exactly his ideology is. It is not the near-anarchistic liberal ideology of Mises or Locke. Neither is it the liberal nanny-statism of Rawls or the globalism of Kant. Hazony's liberalism may be what I am calling liberal nationism, with a heavy dosage of utilitarianism added onto it. The nationism part of his ideology creates the so-called free institutions that ensure the liberal part of his ideology. I refrain from using the word nationalism to describe him because Hazony doesn't place any primacy on nationalism or peoples, but fetishizes the nation-state in some formulation of the rule of laws, not men, without having a fledged-out worldview of nationalism, either metaphysically, ontologically, or existentially, a quality he shares with Mills. Instead, everything is in the frame of realism and utilitarianism where, in his own words, it is evident then that there is no universal right to national independence and self-determination. Whether a people should be supported in a bid for independence is a determination that must be made in consideration of a number of factors. There is a lot more I could say to refute Hazony's book and his liberal nationism project, which he euphemistically calls national conservatism. However, I am going to conclude here. To sum up my arguments against Hazony, he says many stupid things in his book that simply aren't true. He has no actual metaphysical theory of nationalism. He contradicts himself several times throughout his book, most of which stems from providing a theory of the nation-state in the beginning of the book that devolves into a liberal capitalist bourgeois conception of the state serving a utilitarian function which explicitly contradicts the former part of his book. And lastly, that he is in fact a liberal, just of a Millite utilitarian version rather than the Lockean or Rawlsian deontological or rationalist type. And now this is really the end of my critique of Hazony, so I thank you all for listening and I hope to see you next time.